Okay, so, oops, pinned myself. Just a second. There. Okay. So as always, just giving yourself that time for settling in. And I've often come across a figure, well, not often, but every now and then I've come across a figure that people put on how long this takes to get that sort of quietening feeling. And most people seem to reckon about sort of 20 minutes or so. That's what they say for things like sitting meditation, but also when in things like Tai Chi, we do the sort of standing postures. The length of time that they recommend to begin with is around 20 minutes. I think that's probably quite reasonable. I don't think it means that in less than 20 minutes you're not getting any benefit. But I think there's a kind of build-up, isn't there? And of course, in Tai Chi we have these regular routines. You know, the opening part of the class will take something like 20 minutes to half an hour. And I think quite often, once we're past the initial stage of learning the exercises and getting familiar with the sequence, that first stage becomes quite a kind of smooth process. And then we get to a point where we potentially start to learn new things or new aspects. So it's kind of in the second half of the class that we start to kind of go a little bit deeper, if you like. So in your own practice, it's not a bad idea to every now and then. I mean, obviously it depends on your time and so on, various circumstances. But every now and then it's worth trying for a kind of longer session. I always say to people, particularly when we start up, to be reasonable. A few minutes is better than nothing, and I think that's a good approach. And I think it's an approach that even if you didn't ever do any more, you would still get benefit from doing it. But if you're interested in developing the art and finding out more, at least sometimes you need to give yourself a little bit more time to reflect on things and to perhaps investigate and explore a little bit using the movements. And it could be different exercises, or it could just be the same exercises. One thing you could do, for instance, if you can't necessarily remember 40 minutes worth of exercise, but if you can remember this little opening sequence and the initial set of exercises, go through them once and then go through them again, or go through once and maybe count them, maybe do 4 of each, so that it's a limited amount of time. And then when you got to the end, say you've got as far as rowing a boat or wherever you've decided to go back and start again, and not necessarily to count the numbers that you're doing, but just to see what else there is going on within these movements that maybe you didn't notice first time round. So as always, you'll weight slightly forwards, hips dropping back a little bit. Feeling of being suspended, particularly around the middle of your body, your hips, buttocks, pelvis. And just feeling that as you turn in the middle of your body, you're obviously moving in the upper part of your body. And your shoulders follow the movement in your hips, sort of thing. But also maybe a little bit of movement you can feel down in your legs. You'll certainly feel the thigh muscles working hard. And it's interesting, one of the terms used in modern fitness is the core, and core has always seemed to be regarded as this area here around the middle part of the body, abdominals and the muscles around the lower back and so on and so forth. I came across something recently. This was from the Harvard Medical School, so quite an authoritative source. And they were talking about the core as being that area, but also the gluteus, the muscles in your bottom, and the quadriceps as well, which fits very much with our understanding in Tai Chi, I think, when we look at it that way. I would also argue that the hamstrings are part of that. So there's this kind of evolution of that sort of thinking, something perhaps a little bit more holistic. Remember the phrase, when one part of your body is in motion, the whole body is in motion. The whole body is engaged, is perhaps the way of thinking of it. Your whole body is affected. Both will be equally valid, I think. And if you can feel that little bit of change, so when I go to the right, it feels like there's more pressure through the right leg, and then when I turn to the left, more pressure in the left leg, you can begin to follow that. You can just let your weight move a little bit. So when your weight's in the middle, what you're feeling is the sense that the weight is about to move. Now you're just allowing it to move a little. It's not a big movement. It's only to about 60%. You can make it a little bit more just by taking a wider stance. And that's quite nice too. So when you do this, your legs are more actively a part of the movement. You can either think that as you turn, that directs your weight to one side or another. Or if you prefer, you can think that your weight dropping down in one leg pushes you across and your center turns. Again, both are valid, and really the movement is both of those. The springiness from the leg starts to push you. It also starts to turn the center, and the combination takes you across. And this is quite nice to get that weight change is quite nice, quite useful. Now just bring your feet closer back together. You'll notice that I tend to have my feet turned forwards in the narrow stance, but turned out in the wide stance. Not everybody does that, but some people find it more useful. And then just hands in front of you, no higher than shoulder height, but probably a little bit lower, and your elbows lower than your hands. Okay, and let your hands drop down. So, letting your hips drop back, bringing your hands around as though you're cradling the ball and chin up. And expanding and change to the wild goose. Now parting the clouds. A dragon plucks the stars from the sky. When you make that little turning movement at the top of the extension, try and just make sure that it's your whole arm. If I come a bit closer here, and I'll exaggerate slightly. I keep my elbow bent, so it's a rotation through the whole of the arm. My arm would normally be higher up, but it's there from the shoulder down. So we know from other exercises that that will engage the muscles, tendons, ligaments, and the energy in that upper part of your chest as well. One more time. We're just doing the first and the last stages of this next exercise, and focus on that rotation. So as you push out, the hand will gradually turn palm out. And again, you're wanting to try and feel that in the shoulder joint. So for a few moments, just sort of ignore your hands and just concentrate, maybe just concentrate on one shoulder and see if you can just feel that rotation. And then shift your attention down to your elbow and then to your wrist. And watch how your hand and your fingers just follow that movement. Now what we want to do, we're going to introduce the turning, and we want to feel that rotation in the shoulder when we do the turning. We're not doing it for the first one. When we do, is stimulated by the turning in your hips. So there was a series of kind of cogwheels, that kind of mechanism you might get in a windmill to translate a vertical movement to a horizontal movement, or vice versa. And again, we want to feel that both, if you like, mechanically, in terms of the physical structure of your body, but also in terms of the movement itself, the energy. So it's important for this one that you keep your hips dropping back. You don't want to do this, which will then restrict that movement in the center part of your body. Do one more round. Now changing. A lot of these rotations come quite naturally. If from here you just let your elbow drop, then your hand will tend to turn. So we're building on these movements that do come quite smoothly and quite naturally. Now we add turn again. And then switching sides. So these rotating movements in the joints, they're very good for the joints. They're a very gentle way of mobilizing all the joints of the body, both in the legs and the upper body and arms. Adding the turn. And then change into rowing the boat in the middle of the lake. Always remember that the joints should not be straining. Think of the various joints of your body as being a bit like the hinges on the door or gate. You don't want them to carry the weight of the building, and then to swing freely. And in the first instance, it's the muscles that are most closely associated with the joint that do the work. One more time. Good. Now go back to a slightly wider stance and go back to this movement, but slowly this time, just transferring your weight across and turn. Transfer and turn. And have your right hand out. So imagine you're just pulling your arm through water. And again, at the end of each swing, it feels sort of natural for the hand to turn. You could do it this way without the turn. You have to make a deliberate effort to do that. If you just let your arms swing naturally, it would tend to turn. So we don't always follow that pathway. Sometimes we do say, well, okay, we're going to turn a different way. We're not restricted by this, but in the first instance, this is what we want to do. Now this time, let your hand just continue swinging up and bring it back across just about shoulder height, and again, your hand would turn. Just tracing a nice smooth circle, which in theory is quite simple. In theory is kind of an easy movement because we tend to equate simple and easy, but they're not the same thing. Actually, drawing a circle isn't that easy to make it a good circle. It's more of an oval, actually. It's not a true circle, but you know what I mean. Try and keep it nice and smooth all the way through. Now, let that arm rest and do the same thing with your left. Your elbow is slightly curved, but try not to sort of hold your arm up like this. See how my shoulders come up. Try and feel that the full weight of your arm is gently pulling on your shoulder. Again, that's quite difficult because if, like many of us, you've developed the habit of sort of hunching your shoulders, these muscles at the top of the shoulders will be quite short. So this, with your shoulders hanging down, you're going to feel a bit tight to begin with. And then the circle. This time when your hand comes up, it's now directly above your right hand and you move them together, going across, just allowing them to rotate. Really to relieve any sense of tightening around your shoulder and your arm. This is wave hands like clouds. And then come back. Okay, bring your feet a little bit closer in, hands in front of you, and Elbows circling, again, feeling movement in the chest, and again, try and avoid lifting your shoulders. One way to do that is as your arms come up, in this case, as your elbows come up, you can do it for any of the exercises, is just to imagine that somebody's very gently pressing down on your shoulders. And at first that's quite difficult, because if you've got this habit of sort of doing this with the shoulders coming up, it's quite difficult to work out how you're going to be able to move the arm. But of course, the top of the humerus, the big bone in the top of in the upper part of the arm, rotates in the shoulder joint. So the shoulder joint itself doesn't need to lift any more than the hinge on your door needs to lift to allow the door to open. And then moving and turning. So going back to that phrase, when one part of the body is in motion, the whole body is in motion. If we take that literally, of course, it's not true. Some parts of your body are engaged in maintaining structure, alignment, and so on and so forth. And they're moving with the body. They're not necessarily actively engaged in the movement part of it. So they're not, essentially, they're not moving, I suppose you could say. But they are part of the movement, because without that alignment and without that structure, you won't be able to move. And it's quite interesting to reflect on that. What are the different parts of your body doing as you make this movement? And then into the full bear plane. And then let your hand come down, turn out a little bit, and now into hitting the ball in front of the shoulder. As always, once you're familiar with the movements, as you all are, then we observe how the body's doing something. You know a movement, the instruction is do this movement. Anybody does it because you've done it enough times to remember. They have that sort of muscle memory, as it's referred to sometimes. And then you can just look at what's happening, how your body is moving. Occasionally you might think, well, hold on, is that a good way of doing it? And the lifting of the shoulder is a classic example. You might think, oh, my shoulder's coming up, can I find a way to drop it? And then suddenly you get that sort of change in the movement. But even the most familiar movements will gradually change and develop your mind. That's certainly what I found in the decades of doing Tai Chi. One more on each side. Come back to the center. Now swing it arms, push it up. And then turn in. Then circling, allowing your rear hand to come into your shoulder. Turning forwards. As you turn the other way, just leave the front hand in position. You just turn it palm up is all. So again, here, as we turn away, there's that rotation in the front hand. Come a bit closer again. You can see what I'm doing. I'm facing the front here. My right hand, so on your left, is down by the hip. And then as I turn, can you see how the front hand, the front arm rotates? That same rotation from the shoulder. Same thing here, looking forward. I turn and the hand extends out a little bit more and rotates. And the rear hand just comes into your shoulder and pushes through. So we get that very strong feeling of a rotation all the way down through your arm into your fingers. So the movement in your shoulder and your hips have an effect on your wrist. One more time on each side. Good. Okay, shake it. 1 foot forwards and transfer your weight. There are several ways that we can play with this movement. Initially, what we want to make sure is that our hips and our shoulders, as much as possible, are facing straight forwards. The problem with that is, this can easily happen, that you go forwards and this back knee collapses inwards. Perhaps it's easy to see from the front. You see this hip coming around, pulls that knee in. It can happen with the front leg, although for most people it seems to happen more with the back leg. But again, it demonstrates the connection between the center part of your body up to your shoulders, of course, because your shoulders are facing the same way as your hip, but it's also having an effect on the leg. Now, sometimes you might not want it to have that effect. So if you come forwards and you feel that your back knee's doing this, collapsing inwards, and you can see it's had a drastic effect on the whole of my structure. What you want to do is you gently push the rear knee out again. And the same thing with the front. So to begin with, you do that separately. You go forwards, you rotate out, and you feel a little stretch on the inside of the leg. But after a while, you find that you can do both together, and that really minimizes the amount of movement in the side of the knee, the amount of strain in the side of the knee. But it's important because if I just let that, you know, my whole structure is going to collapse. We can also begin to turn, and again, there's a sort of, if you like, a natural way to turn in the upper body, and one that is a little bit more against the body, but never tight as always. So we'll go with the first one. You sink back and you just let your body swing round until the hips and your shoulders are facing the same direction that the rear toes are pointing, and then to here. This is very much one of those movements that happens naturally right up to the point where we start to think about it. After all, we don't, you know, if you're in a shop and you get something off the shelf and there's something on the shelf behind you, you don't do this and, you know, your feet stuck to the ground. You would move your feet. It's a perfectly reasonable thing for us to do. But as soon as you start thinking about it, you start, oh, we've got all these things to do. But again, you can think about it being a turn from the center, moving your weight. And then sometimes you can think about the weight sinking down and pushing you back and your center following that turn. And again, eventually they will merge. The problem with the turning is, of course, it does tend to exaggerate that pulling on the knee. But we can make use of that. As I go back here and I feel that pull on the front leg, I can release it by just allowing the front toes to come up. I can even turn the front toes out a little bit here. And as I turn towards the front foot, it's pulling on the knee. I can release that by letting the heel come up. So now we've turned what was a bit of a disadvantage, you know, that twisting of the knee, into something that can actually begin to help us move our leg. All the other things that I've talked about in the past about the stepping still apply. So eventually we realize that that little bit of a turn in the middle of the body actually really helps to move and get movement in the foot. We could even think in terms of here, I come in to get the foot back out to hip width, I raise the foot and I could, this is exaggerate, I could turn. All of these movements, as they become more familiar, will get smaller. So that in the end, it doesn't look as though there's any real turning going on at all, but you can feel the connection. So what we're doing is certain exercises to actually draw our awareness to these very subtle connections in the body. So make this turning movement as big as is appropriate. Just recognize that if I go forward and I turn a long way, I'm probably going to fall over. There'll be a bit of that, but it's all part of the sort of learning process. And then on the other side. So even when you don't see any turning from outside the body, I'm facing the same way. Those links, those connections are there. I remember going to a seminar with Grandmaster Chen Xiaowang once, and he was doing it. So he was just standing there and he was doing this. He was moving his arm, and I remember thinking, this is a bit of a swizz. I spent years and years and years training myself to move in my center, and he's just standing there waving his arm around. But I went closer to see what he was really doing, and it was a really interesting experience. It was like one of those, if you ever go up to a kind of a pool of water, a pond, on a very calm day, the surface of the water is still, But if you look underneath, you can see these kind of currents moving for various reasons. And it was a bit like that. As I got closer, I could just see these kind of changes in his hips and his waist. Very, very subtle indeed. Kind of interesting. The rest of us have to make it a little bit more obvious. So you can begin to just build in the turn. Obviously, until you start raising your heel and your toes, you don't want to turn too far because you don't want to pull on the knee. So it's only quite a small movement. And bear in mind, if I had new people in this group, which I haven't today, I wouldn't necessarily be talking about this. I would just be saying to people, it doesn't matter too much what the angle of your upper body is. You probably all heard me saying this, because I think it's better that way when you're learning and when you're new to this. What I've just been saying to you is probably too much information, but hopefully for people like yourselves, with the amount that you've done, it's not too much information. But do say if it is. I'll try and clarify it at some point. So now you can begin to let the body turn, toes and the heel coming up. And of course, the feet will move through an arc, through a part of a circle. And then taking a few steps, full steps, and here you can see a semicircle. And shake out. Okay, have your right foot forward. So for movements like pigeon spreads its wings, fisherman cast a net, pushing a wave, we're looking straight ahead. When we turn, that affects the arms. It has quite a big effect on the arms. So the movements that require the arms to go straight forwards, ideally we're facing straight forwards. In other words, the hips and the shoulders are kind of parallel to an imaginary line in front of you. If you're facing a wall, you want them parallel to that wall. So let's start off with bird folds its wings, just to remind ourselves of these very subtle rotations and the connection with the chest and upper back. Because you've got this opening in the chest, because you go back, you might find it useful to work with your breath a little bit. It would be an in-breath on the way back, chest opens. And of course, you want the in-breath to be felt all the way down through the body, out-breath as you go forwards. One more time. And then fisherman castanet. Pushing a wave, pushing a boat. And pulsing the monkey, so the front hand stays in place. And again, we have that rotation for the hips and shoulders. Again, with the turning, you can allow your toes, the heel, to raise. So it's the front heel that comes up, is the rear. So it's front toes that come up, it's the rear heel. Let it light in a minute. And so now the step in is kind of obvious. So by observing these subtle connections, changes through the body, what could be quite a confusing exercise, hands and the arms having to coordinate or whatever, we realize becomes one movement. Okay, good. And shake hand. So going back to what I was saying at the beginning of the session about this kind of focusing quality, this settling quality, we need that if we're going to sort of navigate apparently the more complex exercise. If we're going to find that sense of connection, it's important that we start off fairly simply. I think when you know something, yes, you can go straight into it. And sometimes I'll go out and practice, and I'll go straight into a form or something like that. But it's very much a warm up still. It doesn't feel quite kind of there, if you see what I mean, even now. So have your left foot forwards, and bird folds its wings. So the significance of the center part of the body should be obvious by now, and the constant returning of our attention to that part of the body. Our breath, or our sense of being at the center of things rather than on the periphery, for the calming, quietening quality. And for, well, I suppose what we might think of as the coordination. It's not really coordination because these are just connected. And then fisherman cast the net. So eventually that awareness of here, the area between navel and hips, just becomes very much a background quality. You don't even have to consciously think about it. You want to get to a point where if somebody said to you, sort of like, swing your arm over there, but don't turn in your hips, you'd go, how am I supposed to do that? And then pushing away. And then sinking back, pulsing the monkey. So the other name that I've used for that center part of the body is the lower dantian. When we looked at that in things like swimming dragon, we didn't do today, I know. But in a very real sense, in a kind of energetic sense, you can feel that the movement contracts into that and then expands out. And you can see if I exaggerate, so I come in, it's like everything contracts in and out. And in, I'm really exaggerating this at the moment. So there's a sort of energetic pulse, if you like. Yang extending, yin contracting. An ongoing, once again, a kind of circular quality, a cyclical quality. Raising your toes, raising your heel. Feeling that sort of, it's almost like a thread of elastic going down from your hip to your toes, so that as the hip moves a little bit, pelvis moves, draws toes up. And then let the movement just follow that lifting movement. Your heel comes up as you turn, the foot comes in. Then you push the foot back, make sure the foot goes down before you try and do anything else. So we get to here, pull in, and then just settle in. And bring your feet parallel. In the Tai Chi forms, that move is sometimes referred to as step back in the Vipassana monkey because it involves a step back. But we're just stepping there. And I think I may have said the other day, but in case you weren't there, monkey refers to the Monkey King, who's a great Chinese sort of like character in folk tales and so on and so forth. And I suppose the central character in a very famous Chinese classic called Journey to the West. Monkey was an impish character, a bit rebellious and a bit naughty, but basically okay. So the idea of repulsing the monkey isn't a complete rejection, but monkey's the sort of character who you're quite happy exists, but you wouldn't necessarily want them living next door to you. There was a very, very good edition of Melvyn Bragg's In Our Time about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, on Journey to the West. Actually, it was a really interesting one. They had some good people there talking about the sort of symbolism of it, and quite interesting to put that alongside the movement. If you're interested in following it up a little bit, you can get it on iPlayer, the BBC Radio 4 iPlayer. They've got a whole archive of the In Our Time programs with Melvyn Bragg. So there was one, Journey to the West, it was on there. Okay, so rubbing your hands together and then tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. And one shoulder. And jaw. The other side. And onto your back. Hips. Legs. Light on your belly and the upper part of your chest. And check out. Good. Right. So embrace tiger, return to mountain. Sinking down and then pushing up. Wrapping around, drawing in and sinking. One more time. And stand. Check out. Lovely. Thank you very much, everybody.